Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a period of history that is, frankly, just breathtaking in its strategic intensity.
It really is.
We're going deep into the earliest days of statecraft, right after the Prophet Muhammad's death, focusing on the defense and national security doctrine of Abu Bakr As-Siddiq during the Ridda Wars.
And this is really a case study in how to survive total collapse. When you look at the sources for this period, especially what we're calling cases 33 through 40, you're not just reading military history.
No, not all.
You're examining how a brand new state, one that was barely on its feet, navigated this massive simultaneous internal rebellion, how it prevented its own disintegration by imposing order on what was absolute chaos.
Exactly. And I want you to just picture the scene for a moment. The center of the caliphate, Medina, is basically surrounded. The entire Arabian Peninsula is exploding.
11 fronts.
11 fronts of rebellion igniting at once. Many of them led by figures claiming to be prophets themselves or just flat out rejecting the central government's authority. Now, in a situation like that, whether it's the 7th century or today, most governments make a fatal trade-off.
They do. They sacrifice legality for survival.
Right.
Panic starts to dictate policy. You see cruelty. You see administrative processes just thrown out the window, all for a quick, operational edge. The assumption is that the rule of law is a luxury.
A luxury you can't afford when you're facing an existential threat. But the record shows Abu Bakr refused that trade-off. His response wasn't improvisation. It wasn't this panicked lurch to survive. It was the deliberate construction of a constitutional framework for security.
Yes. It was proving you can fight a defensive war with integrity. And that integrity was rooted in a single guiding principle, which is really the thesis for our whole deep dive today.
And what's that?
Security without justice is oppression, and justice without security is illusion.
That is the ultimate balancing act, isn't it?
It is. If your security is built on tyranny, on abandoning your core principles, then what have you really secured? It's just oppression by another name.
But the other side is just as important.
Absolutely. If your idea of justice isn't backed by the power to actually enforce it, to defend the state that provides it, then that justice is just. It's an illusion, an unenforceable dream.
So our mission today is a bit of a shift in focus. We've looked at the rule of law inside the war before, treatment of prisoners, battlefield conduct.
Right.
Now we're zooming out. We're looking at the macro architecture, the grand strategy, the administration, the constitutional design of the war itself, how they manage resources, command, intelligence, diplomacy, all under this impossible level of duress.
So let's unpack that framework, starting with, really, the foundations of survival.
When you're facing 11 crises at once, your resources, men, money, logistics, they're stretched to the breaking point almost immediately.
And often fatally.
So these first 3 cases, 33, 34, and 35, they get right into the state's life support system. How did they mobilize, allocate, and fund this massive response while, and this is the key, retaining the legitimacy to govern?
Okay, so case 33, crisis resource mobilization. The first thing to understand is that this was systematic. It was not a frantic, panicked plan.
Not just throwing bodies at the problem.
Exactly. The administration under Abu Bakr knew that success depended entirely on structured allocation, not just raw fighting power. They had to move men, camels, food, administrative support, all of it across huge, often hostile terrain.
What's so fascinating to me here is that the sources really emphasize this was a calibrated effort. So the question wasn't just how much can we mobilize, but where do we send it first? What were the criteria for prioritizing these 11 fronts?
That's the core of the strategic wisdom here. And the criteria were, well, they were multifaceted. It wasn't just one thing.
So what were they looking at?
They looked at a few key factors. First, the strategic threat level. Is a tribe just refusing to pay Zakat, or are they actively marching on the capital, on Medina?
A huge difference.
A world of difference. Then, the economic value of the region. If you lose rich agricultural land, you're not just losing territory, you're losing future resources.
Right. The ability to keep fighting.
And critically, proximity to loyal tribes. You have to shore up your core support base before you venture deep into hostile territory.
So this shows they weren't just reacting to whoever was shouting the loudest. It was a real intellectual exercise in risk management.
It was.
But the administrative challenge, it must have been immense. Moving all those resources out of the capital usually depletes the center. How did they make sure Medina itself didn't collapse?
Well, this required a Pretty significant administrative innovation for the time. They essentially had to create a dual structure.
A dual structure? What do you mean?
I mean, one part of the administration was focused purely on the emergency war logistics, getting supplies to the front.
The war effort.
The war effort. But another part was focused entirely on maintaining the home economy. The administration in Medina. If you pull every able-bodied person out to fight, who's running the local markets? Who's handling judicial functions? Who's securing the capital itself?
So they had to designate essential personnel, people who were explicitly told, you are not going to the front lines.
Exactly. And that distinction, protecting the state without destroying society, that is such a crucial lesson for modern crisis management.
It really is. If your society collapses back home from hunger or administrative breakdown, you've already lost the strategic war, even if you're winning battles out in the desert.
Precisely. It took incredible foresight to prevent that kind of administrative overload. They knew that if they just let everyone fight in a decentralized way, it would drain the treasury and the logistical reserves almost overnight.
So it wasn't just about moving resources.
No. It was about making sure every single unit that was deployed had a clear written mandate and the supplies they needed for a defined period. This prevented them from, going rogue or having to scavenge because their supply lines were broken. This initial mobilization in Case 33 set the whole legal and logistical template for everything that followed.
Okay, so that brings us to logistics, which leads directly into Case 34. Coordinating 11 campaigns spread all across Arabia in the 7th century. I mean, with no satellites, no instant communication, it just sounds impossible. How did they maintain a single strategic vision?
This is where that commitment to centralized strategic control becomes so important. The sources talk about the conceptual drawing of a master map.
A master map. Now, that's not a modern map with the GPS coordinates, obviously.
No, not at all. Think of it more like a strategic visualization, a synthesized plan that dictated the sequence, the timing, and the synchronization of operations across the entire peninsula.
The idea of a master map is so compelling because it implies they were thinking in strategic phases, not just random skirmishes. It suggests a certain proportionality of effort.
Absolutely. They had to decide exactly how much resource to allocate to each theater, and not just based on the size of the enemy, but on its location relative to the final strategic goal.
Which means they understood the biggest risk of all.
Overextension.
Exactly. If you try to fight everywhere at once with limited forces, you basically guarantee you're going to lose everywhere.
And the wisdom of Case 34 is summed up in this one lesson. Fight wisely and in order. They sequence the operations. They'd assign a commander to a specific region and often require them to finish that campaign before moving to reinforce or start another one.
That requires just incredible self-discipline at the top. I mean, can you imagine the pressure? You have reports flooding in, some are victories, some are catastrophic losses, and the central authority has to stick to the plan.
And refuse to divert forces to save a non-critical front if that move risks the primary objective. This ability to maintain that central strategic vision, while the actual fighting was so widely spread out, it required institutional discipline. This is what defined the caliphate as a unified political and military entity, not just, a loose collection of loyal tribes. It was a single administrative body.
So the structure had to manage conflicting demands, competition for resources, maybe even some egotistical commanders?
All through the authority of that central plan.
And the logistics of that sequencing are still just mind-boggling. They were essentially creating a kind of primitive joint command structure. The forces in the south had to know that the forces in the north were moving on a schedule.
Yes, so they could anticipate troop movements, supply access points, the whole rhythm of the war.
It's the historical equivalent of a modern National Security Council, making sure all the different parts of the military are operating under one coherent, centrally managed strategy.
A very good analogy.
Okay, now we get to what might be the most contentious decision of all. Case 35, the fight over Zakat. We know it was a mandatory payment, but why was refusing to pay it seen as a constitutional breach, a rejection of the state, and not just, say, a personal religious failing or tax evasion?
This decision goes right to the heart of what defines a constitutional state. I mean, think about it. If the state is required by its own foundational laws to provide security, to administer justice, to ensure welfare, it needs a system of mandatory public finance to do those things.
It needs money.
It needs money. The moment citizens or subjects claim the right to refuse that fiscal contribution, they are, in effect, severing the constitutional contract.
So the argument that Abu Bakr was making wasn't purely theological, even though that was part of it. The core issue was functional legitimacy.
It was. Without a mandatory tax structure, the caliphate literally could not afford to exist. It couldn't pay for the army needed for security or the administrators needed for justice.
Like, if appliance is optional, then the state is optional.
Precisely. And that's where his Holiness Declaration comes in. And it just strips away all ambiguity. He says, "By Allah, if they withhold even a rope they used to give for Zakat, I will fight them over it."
Let's focus on that detail. The rope. It's such an arresting image. It could sound petty if you don't understand the context.
Right. But he wasn't talking about the market value of a piece of rope.
No, he was talking about the principle.
It is purely about the principle of compliance. The value of the rope was nothing. The value of the principle, that the central authority is recognized and funded down to the smallest detail, that was absolute.
So allowing even that one tiny deviation would have created a fatal loophole.
A fatal loophole.
Right.
It would have opened the door for people to argue that if the payment is small enough, it can be avoided. He was drawing a constitutional line in the sand. The state's fiscal authority is non-negotiable.
And this established a massive precedent. Public finance is the indispensable backbone of lawful governance. Without it, the state collapses and the rule of law goes with it.
And that precedent holds true today, whether it's Zakat, income tax, import tariffs. Tax compliance is the foundation of any constitutional order. By fighting over this, Abu Bakr was legally cementing the resource foundation for his entire security doctrine. He was turning the caliphate from just a spiritual community into a viable political and administrative state.
It's an incredible intellectual leap to realize that fighting over a rope was actually fighting for the Constitution itself.
Yes, it truly was.
Okay, so resources are mobilized, the financial foundation is secure. Now we have to turn to controlling the forces themselves. I think the biggest challenge in any crisis is maintaining moral and legal control over the very military you've empowered to win the war.
A timeless problem.
And cases 37 and 38 detail exactly how the caliphate managed this really volatile dynamic.
And the tension here is, as you said, timeless. How do you give a general the immense operational power they need to win a brutal war, while at the same time guaranteeing that the political center maintains absolute constitutional control?
A very delicate balance.
Abu Bakr achieved it by establishing a crystal-clear chain of command and coupling that with really stringent accountability measures.
The figure everyone always points to here is Khalid ibn al-Walid, a legendary commander, hugely effective.
Indispensable to the victory, no question.
But the sources are so clear on this. Even he operated under written instructions, explicit limits to his authority. Now, enforcing that kind of bureaucratic requirement in the field, that must have been incredibly difficult.
And that's where the critical thinking comes in. Because you're right. How pragmatic was this, really? In the heat of a desert war, miles from Medina, wasn't there a huge risk that requiring detailed instructions would just slow everything down?
It seems like a massive strategic trade-off. You know, speed and flexibility usually win battles, but accountability is what ensures the state survives the victory.
And the sources suggest the administration knew about this tension. They resolved it by making the instructions strategic and principled, rather than purely tactical.
What does that mean in practice?
It means the instructions defined the constitutional limits of his power, who to target, what graduated response protocols to follow, the legal constraints on seizing property or punishing civilians. They weren't meant to dictate, which flank to attack in a specific battle.
Ah, okay. So the written instructions weren't designed to micromanage the battle itself. They were designed to define the legal perimeter, the sandbox that the commander was authorized to play in.
Exactly. And this transforms the general from being a powerful, independent warlord into a formal agent of the central government. He's legally bound by the caliph's overall strategy and moral mandates.
So this system of delegated power, always subject to review and a recall, it prevents internal tyranny. The moment a general felt they were acting outside that written instruction, they knew they risked being censured or recalled, no matter how successful they were on the battlefield.
That's right.
This framework is just a masterpiece of constitutional control over the military. It means the state's victory doesn't rely on the personal loyalty or character of one powerful man. It relies on the authority of the legal structure itself. Power is delegated, never surrendered.
And that is the crucial element for any modern state. It ensures the military remains subservient to civilian legal authority. By having that paper trail, that written mandate, The center always maintains the ultimate right to intervene or hold commanders accountable if they overstep their constitutional limits. The chaos of war was being fought within a frame of administrative discipline.
Okay, next, let's talk about the control of information. In a widespread, multi-front civil war, panic, exaggeration, false reports, these things are basically weapons.
They are.
And Case 38 emphasizes the need for reliable intelligence as the basis for lawful action.
Abu Bakr understood that strategy that's divorced from verified facts is just reckless, and any state action based on rumor is both illegal and illegitimate. So he established a pretty sophisticated network for the time. Dedicated messengers, scouts, and specific formalized reports from each front.
Formalized reports, that's the key phrase. It wasn't just hearing news, it was a structure designed to confirm if the information was true. What did that system actually look like? How did they standardize reporting to filter the panic from the facts?
It required two things: speed and skepticism. Messengers were often sent with secondary scouts who could verify basic facts, like the size of an enemy force or the loyalty of a local tribe. But more importantly, the central administration was trained to look for consistency across multiple reports.
So cross-referencing sources.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
If two different messengers arrived from two different loyal areas and they both confirmed the same hostile movement, then that information was elevated. If a report was just based on hearsay, it was treated as unverified until it could be confirmed.
Information really is the lifeblood of lawful strategy. If the central government acts on an inflated rumor of rebellion, they might commit forces and resources that are totally disproportionate to the actual threat.
Which would lead to unnecessary bloodshed and violate the very principles of justice we've been talking about.
Right.
So decisions to reinforce a position, to initiate a retreat, or even to open negotiations were only made after verified intelligence arrived. The administration consciously rejected making decisions based on those initial emotional, panicked reports. For instance, if a report came in saying a whole tribe was wiped out, the caliph would typically wait for a follow-up confirmation from another reliable source before he'd redirect entire armies.
In today's world of instant, often unverified social media information, this historical insistence on verifiable truth in a crisis is, well, it's profoundly relevant. The ability to filter the noise and act only on confirmed facts is essential for keeping legitimacy and preventing strategic failure.
It's the infrastructure that ensures the government's actions are grounded in reality. Functional intelligence services, standardized crisis communication protocols. These aren't just military tools. They are constitutional mechanisms that protect the integrity of the whole decision-making process. They let the state classify threats accurately and ensure that when force is used, it's against the actual threat, not a phantom.
Okay, so let's shift now to the ethical, the legal, and the strategic restraints that were placed on the use of state violence. This is really where the commitment to justice confronts the brutal reality of war.
This is where the rubber hits the road.
Cases 36, 39, and 40 define the constitutional limits of force, and they're all about ensuring the state did not become the oppressor it was fighting.
And one of the most impressive elements of this entire doctrine was the formal recognition that not all opposition was equal. You had diehard apostates, sure, but you also had tribes that were just confused or misled or maybe just financially distressed.
And treating them all with the same iron fist would have been a disaster.
Strategically and morally, yes. So this necessitated the establishment of a proportional, escalating scale of response.
Let's detail that scale because it shows just remarkable restraint, especially given the existential nature of the threat. The sources define it as dialogue, then warning, then limited force, and only then a full-scale campaign. Why this methodical patience?
That patience was strategic genius. By going up that escalation ladder step by step, the caliphate achieved several things at once. First, it legitimized the eventual use of full force. It proved that every possible effort at a peaceful resolution had been tried and had failed.
It gives them the moral high ground.
It does. And second, and this is crucial, it provided an off-ramp for those tribes who were just confused or hesitant. It let them come back into the fold without mass bloodshed.
So the state was using this protocol to proactively peel away the soft opposition from the hardcore ideological rebels.
Precisely. The sources give specific examples where tribes were invited to repent and renew their allegiance before any military action was even authorized. And this act of invitation, even while war was raging elsewhere, it framed the entire conflict. This wasn't a war of aggression by Medina. This was a lawful restoration of the existing constitutional order against those who willfully broke the contract.
By starting with dialogue, you're clearly communicating the state's expectations and also the consequences of refusal. You ensure that when military force is finally used, it's clearly demonstrated to be the failure of the resistors, not the impatience or cruelty of the state.
And proportionality, in this context, is framed not just as an ethical rule, but as a constitutional virtue. It's essential for long-term stability. It served to minimize bloodshed and conserve resources. I mean, why spend troops and treasure fighting a tribe that you can bring back with a strongly worded but diplomatic letter?
It's a direct parallel to modern rules of engagement, which insists that force must be proportionate to the threat and that non-lethal means have to be considered first.
It's the same logic, absolutely.
Okay, this next one, Case 39, is maybe the most legally demanding decision of the entire doctrine. And I think we need to slow down and really appreciate the nuance here. The Caliph insisted on legally precise definitions, differentiating between apostates, rebels, bandits, and ordinary criminals. Why was this granular legal distinction so important during a period of such chaos?
This is the true test of a constitutional state, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can you maintain judicial integrity when your very existence is on the line? The distinction was critical because the constitutional consequence of how you classified someone determined everything.
Everything.
Their legal treatment, the judicial process they would face, the rights of the opponent. If you fail to make these distinctions, you end up with mass injustice and strategic failure.
Let's break down those consequences. If you classify a group as apostates, that carries the severest legal penalty. But if they're just rebels, what protections might they still have under the law?
The difference is vast. If a tribe was classified as an apostate, meaning they had severed all political and theological ties with the state, their actions were seen as an existential threat to the constitutional order and its underlying faith. This often meant capital punishment for the leaders and confiscation of assets.
Okay, but if they were classified merely as a rebel?
A rebel, or buhat in the legal terminology, was someone who was still considered within the fold of the faith, but was actively defying the caliph's political authority, maybe over zakat, maybe over allegiance. Under early Islamic constitutional law, if they surrendered, their property rights were often retained.
Their property rights were retained.
Often, yes. And the judicial process was different. The goal with a rebel was submission and reintegration. The goal of an apostate was the defense of the state's fundamental identity.
That distinction retaining property rights for rebels, that is a massive incentive for a peaceful resolution. It underscores that this is about long-term stability. The state is fighting to restore political order, not just to seize wealth or annihilate an entire population.
Exactly. And then you have bandits. People who were just focused on highway robbery, local disruption, with no major political agenda. They were dealt with through criminal justice protocols, not full military campaigns. And of course, ordinary criminals fell under standard civil law.
So by maintaining these four distinct legal classifications, the caliphate ensured its security policy was legally precise. It wasn't driven by vague, emotional catch-all labels like enemy or terrorist.
And that prevents the generalization of the enemy, which is so destructive in modern conflicts. It ensures that the rule of law demands this granular categorization. You apply different statutes, different protocols based on the intent and the constitutional action of the opposition.
It is the highest expression of that core principle we started with. Security without justice is oppression. You cannot have just security unless your legal frameworks are robust enough to distinguish between a political opponent who needs to be subdued, a criminal who needs to be judged, and an existential threat that must be fought.
Well said.
Okay, finally, let's look at the persistent role of diplomacy, even when military victory was far from certain. Using diplomacy as the first step, and even during an active conflict, that seems strategically risky. Why was it considered the first pillar of just security?
Because the ultimate goal wasn't just to win the battle, it was to build the nation. If force is your last resort, then diplomacy has to be your first. The historical sources stress this again and again. Abu Bakr consistently sent letters, envoys, delegations to tribes, offering them clear terms for a peaceful return to the political fold before military campaigns were even fully launched.
And crucially, this wasn't just a token gesture. We know from the record that many tribes actually accepted. They reconciled, they renewed their bay'ah, their pledge of allegiance, all because of clear communication and the guarantee of fair treatment. They avoided what would have been costly, bloody conflicts.
This positioning of diplomacy, it fundamentally reframed the entire conflict. It showed this wasn't about vengeance, it was about reconciliation, about restoring the covenant. By offering a path back a path to renew the pledge and return to constitutional obedience. The caliphate was demonstrating that its power was wielded in service of the community, not against it.
The strategic advantage is just undeniable. Offering reconciliation saves resources, it minimizes casualties on both sides, and it fundamentally changes the nature of the peace that follows. If you can convert a potential enemy into a loyal citizen through dialogue instead of coercion, you've achieved a long-term strategic victory that far outweighs any single battlefield success.
It speaks to the state's vision for the future. If you burn all the bridges, you create a long-term insurgency problem. But if you offer a structured, lawful path for return, you minimize the future burdens of occupation and policing. This decision basically enshrined diplomacy as a constitutional requirement. Force is the last resort, only necessary when all peaceful legal avenues have been completely exhausted.
So this whole analysis of Abu Bakr's decisions, cases 33 through 40, has really shown how a powerful, effective defense doctrine can be built without abandoning your legal and ethical mandates. It's an integrated system. Each decision supports the integrity of the whole.
Let's just quickly review those 8 pillars that define this constitutional defense architecture. It started with planned resource mobilization, that was case 33, ensuring security didn't lead to social collapse at home.
That resource deployment was then guided by multi-theater coordination, case 34. A single strategic mind overseeing these widely dispersed operational hands.
And the entire effort was financed by a non-negotiable financial mechanism. Fiscal obedience, the Zakat, which is established as a mandatory constitutional obligation in case 35, that provided the funding backbone.
The use of that power was then restrained, first by a graduated response, case 36, which maximized the chance for a peaceful return and ensured proportionality.
And the instruments of that force were controlled internally by clear emergency command structures, case 37, making sure power was delegated but never independent, always bound by written accountability.
Those strategies were grounded in reality by verified intelligence, case 38, rejecting decisions based on rumor or panic and protecting the integrity of the whole process.
And critically, the targets of that force were legally and constitutionally defined through precise legal categories of threat. That's case 39, ensuring the punishment fit the crime and preventing that arbitrary lumping together of different groups.
And finally, the whole doctrine was capped by diplomacy before force, case 40, ensuring that the military option was always the last resort, maximizing the potential for reconciliation.
When you put it all together, the synthesis is just powerful. These decisions turned the nascent caliphate into a model where faith, law, and strategy all worked in concert. They didn't just preserve the physical existence of the state, they preserved the moral soul of its governance. By building this architecture, Abu Bakr established this profound historical precedent for how to fight and win an existential war while maintaining the rule of law.
It is an extraordinary example of leadership maintaining the highest principles during the deepest crisis imaginable. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into constitutional history and the strategic architecture of crisis management.
The final overarching theme we can draw from all these sources is this. Security was framed as a duty to protect the innocent and restrain the oppressor, and it was firmly rooted in constitutional order. It proves that a state can be immensely strong without sacrificing its principles or becoming cruel.
A lesson that echoes across the millennia.
And we've established that the doctrine wasn't designed just for victory, but for peace. The principles of proportionality, of categorization, of diplomacy, they directly impacted what came next, the phase of reconciliation and nation building.
So, building on that strategic imperative, the need to reconcile and reintegrate, here's our final thought for you to consider. If the fundamental goal of national security is not merely military victory, but the eventual reintegration and trust building with the opposing population, essentially converting former rebels into loyal citizens and future allies, how fundamentally does that strategic imperative change the way a government conducts war, from the very first skirmish to the final peace treaty? We'll leave you with that question to explore.